They were never supposed to make it. A punk band named after a video game system. Sounded like a joke. Yet from a small Indiana basement, they turned teenage heartbreak, skate park loneliness, and the glow of a PlayStation screen into something loud enough to fill stadiums. The Ataris weren't built for trends. They were the rebellion against them. In an era where pop-punk was dominated by California energy, they were the outsiders, Midwest kids writing about lost summers and love letters never sent. When the world was chasing fame, they chased feeling. When others tried to sound perfect, they stayed real. And that's why, when So Long Astoria hit the airwaves in 2003, it didn't just play, it stuck. For millions, it wasn't an album. It was a timestamp, a photograph of growing up, breaking down, and still believing in something honest. So how did a group of nobodies with a gamer name become the emotional backbone of an entire punk generation? That's the story of the Ataris. Before the crowds, the tours, or the MTV cameras, there was just Chris Rowe, a kid from Anderson, Indiana, sitting cross-legged on a bedroom floor with an old acoustic guitar and a half-broken Atari console blinking in the dark. He didn't look like the kind of kid who'd build a brand that would one day define early 2000s punk rock. But that's exactly the point. Chris and his guitarist Jason Thomason were chasing a feeling. They grew up in a town where dreams had a curfew, where you learned to make your own fun, your own stories, your own way out. And for Chris and Jason, music was that escape plan. They found comfort in melody and defiance in storytelling. As you would imagine, their first songs were messy, honest, and human. But that's what made them real. That's what made them punk. When it came time to name his band, Chris didn't overthink it. He called it the Ataris. Not because it sounded cool or because it meant something. Atari wasn't just a console. It was a trip back to childhood. To simpler times, 8-bit dreams, and the days when hope came in pixels. He once said he chose the name as a reminder of where you come from, not where the world says you should go. That nostalgia became their rebellion. In an age where punk was turning corporate, Chris and Jason built a band that worshipped the past while still screaming for the future. Armed with a 4-track recorder, a few blank tapes, and an address book full of punk zine editors, he began his hustle. Mailing demos, trading letters, recording until sunrise. This was the late 90s. No internet, no shortcuts, no Spotify. Just heart, postage stamps, and cassette hiss. Fans started passing those demos around like secret messages. One tape led to another. Then came shows, word of mouth, and the growing sense that something real, something different was happening. Every early Atari song carried a pulse of nostalgia and pain. Stories of broken homes, summer drives, missed chances. Surprisingly, every song hit home. In reality, they weren't trying to be the loudest guy in punk. He was trying to be the most honest. That became their silent manifesto. Stay nostalgic in a world that's always trying to forget. And in that small Indiana bedroom, they weren't just recording songs. They were coding emotion. In 4 tracks, on a budget, and with the kind of sincerity that no major label could ever fake. Because before the Ataris were a band, they were a belief that sometimes the smallest towns build the loudest hearts. By the early 2000s, punk rock was shifting. Blink-182 were on MTV. Green Day were stadium kings, and every teenager suddenly owned a wallet chain. But tucked behind that glamorous curtain was a quieter, raw heartbeat, and it belonged to the Ataris. Chris Rowe had been writing non-stop, carrying his notebooks from van to motel, living off gas station coffee and dreams. After releasing a string of indie records through Kung Fu Records, the band had earned cult respect. The kind built from years of sweaty shows and genuine connection. Then came the moment that changed everything. A major label deal with Columbia Records. For the first time, the Ataris had studio budgets, producers, deadlines, and expectations. But Chris didn't want polish. He wanted truth. He once said in an interview, "If I lose what's real about this, I lose myself." So while other bands chased radio formulas, he built So Long Astoria, an album that felt like a time capsule, sealed in sound. The title came from The Goonies, that classic 80s adventure film about never letting go of your childhood dreams. And that's exactly what the album was. A love letter to youth, memory, and the fleeting summers that never really leave you. Every track was soaked in nostalgia. In This Diary became a soundtrack for every road trip, breakup, and long drive home after a concert. The saddest song hit harder. A letter to Chris's daughter, written in honesty that didn't sound like anything else in the punk world at that time. The album was a breakthrough, both emotionally and commercially. So Long Astoria climbed the Billboard charts, and suddenly, the Ataris, the band with a video game name, were on MTV. For a band that once recorded in basements, that moment was surreal. But success didn't make them slick. It made them seen. Critics said it best. So Long Astoria wasn't just punk rock. It was growing up in real time. And with that album, the Ataris had carved out their legacy. Punk that made you feel, not just move. Because they reminded the world that nostalgia could be louder than rebellion. It started as a quiet experiment. Chris Rowe had always been drawn to melody, especially those shimmering, bittersweet tunes of the 80s. Among them was Don Henley's The Boys of Summer. To most, it was a classic. To Chris, it was a challenge. He didn't want to replicate it. He wanted to reclaim it. The Ataris turned Henley's reflective melancholy into something raw and electric. Suddenly, that once slick California pop song was pulsing with heartbeat. The line that changed everything, "Out on the road today, I saw a black flag sticker on a Cadillac," became a badge of rebellion. A generation of punk kids who had never even heard the original suddenly felt it in their bones. When Los Angeles radio station K-Rock started spinning the track, it wasn't even supposed to be a single. The band had already chosen My Reply, but fans demanded it, and soon, it was everywhere. Every skate video, every mall speaker, every road trip mix burned onto scratched CDs had that one track, the Ataris, The Boys of Summer. Within months, the song soared to number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, marking the band's highest charting single ever. MTV picked it up, college radio couldn't stop playing it, and suddenly, a punk band from Indiana was shoulder to shoulder with mainstream giants. But with success came friction. Some fans called it selling out. Others said it was genius, punk with poetry. Chris's version had emotion without age, a bridge between generations, who grew up on cassette tapes and those raised on Napster. For the Ataris, though, fame had a strange echo. The very song that made them global icons also began to box them in. Promoters wanted that energy, not the band's quieter, introspective tracks. The cover was a blessing and a curse. It opened doors while closing others. Chris later admitted in interviews that while he loved the success, it never quite felt like his. It was beautiful, he said, but it wasn't where our hearts lived. And that's the paradox of the Ataris, a band built on memory, emotion, and truth, caught between the roar of recognition and the silence of self-doubt. Fame. It's the dream every band chases until it finally arrives. Then it becomes the loudest noise in the room. By the early 2000s, the Ataris were no longer the kids from Anderson, Indiana. They were headlining tours, playing warped stages, and hearing thousands scream along to songs that were written in someone's basement. But success, as it often does, came with its own poison. Internally, cracks began to show. The band that once bonded over late-night drives and cheap pizza was now tangled in label deadlines, radio pressures, and creative block. The punk scene they'd helped revive was now being polished, marketed, and commodified. And suddenly, authenticity wasn't just a value. It was a currency. Chris Rowe, the band's beating heart, found himself torn between staying raw and staying relevant. Tracks like In This Diary and The Saddest Song were not built for fame. They were built for truth. But the higher they rose, the louder the friction grew. Bandmates left, lineups changed, and like any great punk story, was getting frustrated. There were nights when fists replaced feedback, moments where the man behind the mic became the villain in his own narrative. Still, in the wreckage, something refused to die. That same restless defiance that started it all. Because punk, at its core, isn't about perfection. It's about showing up broken, bleeding, and still meaning every word you scream. Through every lineup change, every failed label push, every critical jab, the Ataris never traded sincerity for safety. Even when the world moved on to pop-punk clones and radio-friendly rebellion, Rowe held on to what he believed punk really meant. Personal truth, not public approval. Their shows became smaller, rawer, more personal again, like the early days. the connection returned, not in the charts, but in the faces in front of them. And in that full circle way, the Ataris rediscovered what they'd lost. Not fame, not momentum, but meaning. Because sometimes, the real rebellion is staying true long after everyone stopped watching. They didn't vanish. They evolved. When the noise faded and trends moved on, the Ataris quietly rewired themselves. Then, out of nowhere, the posters began to appear again. Reunion tours, nostalgia-driven and electric. Crowds returned not out of curiosity, but loyalty. The faces had changed. Older now, but the hearts were the same. Every lyric still hit like it did back then, only this time, it meant more. The band traded the chaos of fame for something purer. Connection. Smaller venues, rawer sets, and a sound that felt like the early years. Imperfect, emotional, alive. New songs carried that same pulse, confessional, melodic, and fiercely honest. And in those echoes, younger bands like the Wonder Years and Mayday Parade found their blueprint. Proof that punk could still mean something real. Because the Ataris never sold out. They just grew up without giving in. Still punk. Still honest. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not the hits or the headlines, but the heart that refused to fade. From a basement dream to a generation's anthem, the Ataris didn't just play punk rock. They lived it. Loud, flawed, and unforgettable. So tell us in the comments below, what's the song that still takes you back to your own Astoria? If this story hit a chord, subscribe for more untold legends behind the music that shaped us.